They whispered, laughed, and dismissed her as just another old woman in a church pew frail, quiet, forgettable. But when a youth volunteer spotted a strange tattoo on her wrist, everything changed. What they thought was a biker mark turned out to be something far more chilling and heroic. Margaret Walsh wasn't just a churchgoer. She had once operated behind enemy lines in World War II, and for decades, she never told a soul. Why did she stay silent, and what finally made the truth surface in a quiet town church at age 95? This is the story of the spy no one saw coming. Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The sanctuary was warm with late morning light filtering through stained glass, casting soft patterns of blue and gold across the pews. It was the kind of light that made dust motes look like something sacred. A hush had settled over the congregation. As the organ played the final chords of the prelude, Pastor Emily adjusted her robe near the altar, eyes scanning the room as worshipers settled in. It was just another Sunday at Hillview Lutheran, a routine of hymnals, soft murmurs, and the faint clink of offering envelopes being passed hand to hand. Near the front of the church, in pew 3, sat a small, hunched woman wrapped in an old, beige trench coat. The coat was too heavy for spring and had threadbare cuffs. Her gray hair, once neatly curled, had loosened into soft waves that clung to her cheekbones in the humidity. She bowed her head as the choir rose to sing, hands folded tightly in her lap. To her left and right, the pews were empty. A few rows back, clustered on the right side of the sanctuary, sat the youth volunteer group. They were new brought in by the church's community outreach initiative. Teenagers from the local high school, encouraged to log service hours and help with food drives, ushering, or nursery watch. There were 5 of them today, seated together, whispering in the way teens do when they think the rest of the world has gone deaf. One of the girls, wearing a sunflower yellow hoodie, nudged her friend and nodded toward the front pew. "She's always alone," she whispered, just loud enough for the others to hear. "Never takes communion, doesn't even sing." A boy with sharp cheekbones and headphones tucked into his collar leaned forward. "Look at that coat. Looks like something out of a war movie. She probably thinks it's still 1950, another girl said under her breath, stifling a laugh. Their laughter was soft, not mean in the way of bullies, but casual, born from the kind of ignorance that comes with youth and a lifetime of assuming everyone older is just background. They watched the woman lean forward in prayer. Noting the awkward way she clutched her side, like something hurt, Pastor Emily's voice broke the quiet as she stepped to the pulpit and welcomed everyone. The teens quieted, heads turning forward, but their eyes still flicked toward the old woman from time to time. One of them pulled out a phone, angling it just enough to snap a photo of the strange figure in pew 3. Not to post it, not yet, just to laugh about later. The woman didn't seem to notice. When it came time to rise for the first hymn, she stood slowly, her fingers gripping the back of the pew in front of her. The trench coat shifted, and something beneath the cuff of her sleeve caught a glint of light just for a second, a flash of inked skin, faint but distinct. A few of the teens squinted. "Did you see that?" The boy in the headphones murmured, "She's got a tattoo." The girl beside him frowned. "Seriously? That old? Who even had tattoos back then?" They leaned in, whispering again. The ink had looked like a triangle, or maybe a dagger, but it had been too quick to tell. Their amusement grew, fueled by the mystery and the absurdity of it. The woman had sat in that church for years, and yet felt like a ghost, never talking, never invited to church potlucks, never volunteering for anything, just ... present ... by. Time the scripture reading began, their curiosity had become something closer to ridicule. Every time she moved, their eyes followed her. Every gesture, every wrinkle, every moment she lifted her frail hand to adjust her glasses felt strange to them, like watching someone from another planet. To the rest of the congregation, Margaret Walsh was just another quiet elder, one of many aging members who came each week out of habit or hope. But to the youth in pew 7, she was a puzzle they didn't care to solve that morning, when her sleeves slipped just a little too far. And even then, they didn't ask her. They just laughed, again quieter now, but still not silent. They didn't know that the story they were mocking was older than their school, older than their church, older than the houses they returned to after service. They didn't know that the hands they ridiculed once carried secrets in enemy territory, that the trench coat had once been hidden in a hayloft beneath a radio too dangerous to speak of. They didn't know any of that, not yet. The sanctuary had grown even quieter now, the sermon having folded itself into stillness. The choir sat down in silence, hands resting on their laps, as Pastor Emily moved toward the communion table. A brass tray holding polished silver cups glinted under the overhead lights, and the scent of grape juice and baked bread hung softly in the air. Congregants rose and formed a slow-moving line, moving toward the altar in familiar rhythm. It was a ritual marked by gentle steps and whispered amens, the sound of shoes brushing carpet, a cane tapping softly here and there. Margaret Walsh rose with the rest of the front pew, taking her time. Her joints did not move with ease anymore, and her right knee had a way of buckling if she stood too quickly. She leaned heavily on the pew in front of her, lifting herself upright with a soft exhale that only those standing nearby could hear. In her hands, the church bulletin crinkled faintly, held, not as a guide, but more like something to steady her fingers with. The youth group remained seated, having been instructed not to participate in communion unless they had completed confirmation, which most had not. They sat in the fourth pew back, watching as the line of older parishioners made their way slowly to the altar rail. It was a peaceful moment for most, but not for Kayla. Kayla, the girl in the sunflower hoodie, leaned over the edge of the pew as Margaret passed by them in the aisle. Something had caught her eye, not the usual softness of age, but something stark as Margaret reached for the usher's hand to steady herself. Her sleeve slid back slightly, and for a second or two, it was visible, a small, faded blue symbol on the inside of her left wrist. Simple in design, but foreign in shape. It looked sharp enough to not belong. Kayla blinked and leaned toward her friend Marissa. "Did you see that?" She whispered her wrist. Marissa, more interested in the phone she was sneakily checking in her lap, looked up too late. "What? She's got a tattoo or something like right here." Kayla motioned to her own wrist. "I swear, it looked like a triangle or a sword." "I don't know." The boys sitting behind them perked up. "You serious?" one of them asked, suppressing a smirk. "What is she? Some retired biker chick?" "I'm not kidding," Kayla said, now twisting. Round for another look. It didn't look normal. Not like a butterfly or a name or anything. "I bet it's one of those prison tattoos," another voice chimed in, low enough to avoid adult attention. "Maybe she did time back in the day." A muffled laugh moved down the row like a wave, though no one dared speak above a whisper. The service was still moving, solemn and slow. Margaret had just knelt at the rail, receiving the small cube of bread on her tongue from Pastor Emily. Her eyes closed as she bowed her head. Behind her, the teens watched with narrowed eyes, their imaginations taking hold of something they didn't understand. They didn't know the shape. They didn't know the ink was from another time, another world entirely. To them, it was strange, something from outside their frame of reference, not part of the quiet, cardigan-wrapped reality of church. The sleeve had slipped back over the tattoo, but the damage was already done, at least in their minds. A story had begun to form, one they filled with cliches and jokes. Kayla mouthed the word tattoo again, like it didn't belong on someone that old. Someone who wore orthopedic shoes and took 3 steps to rise from Anila. Someone who had never spoken more than 10 words to anyone under 40. They didn't ask her. They didn't want to know. Not really. Because it was easier to believe she was eccentric than exceptional. Easier to laugh than to imagine that the mark on her wrist might not be the result of rebellion, but of duty, of quiet, deliberate courage. They dismissed it the way people do when they're uncomfortable with mystery, by reducing it to something familiar, something harmless. But even as they laughed, something lingered. A small discomfort, a question none of them voiced yet. Why would a 95-year-old woman have a tattoo like that? The folding chairs in Fellowship Hall scraped gently against the linoleum floor as the post-service crowd began to shuffle in. It was the usual hum of chatter, styrofoam coffee cups filled with small plates of store-bought cookies, and powdered donuts passed around like clockwork. The overhead fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting a pale tint over the room. The church's older women arranged napkins near the coffee urn, already asking each other whether the lemon bars were homemade or from the store again. Was as it always was. Margaret Walsh entered slowly, the heel of her orthopedic shoe dragging slightly on the threshold as she moved from the sanctuary into the reception area. She carried no purse, just her bulletin folded neatly in one hand, as though she hadn't yet decided whether to keep it or toss it. Her trench coat, still buttoned despite the heat, brushed against the side of a folding chair as she passed. No one stopped to greet her. No one offered to pour her coffee. She walked like someone who knew exactly where she wanted to be, and exactly how little anyone else wanted her there. Her eye scanned the table briefly, noting the old brown percolator steaming at the corner, the plate of mini muffins next to the untouched fruit tray, and then, almost as an afterthought, the powdered donuts dot in the far corner of the room by the bulletin board with pinned announcements and faded photos from last year's Christmas pageant. The group of teenagers clustered together. Kayla was still talking about the tattoo, but now her voice was lower, just loud enough for her friends to catch each word. Seriously, it was like a symbol, not like a flower or a heart. It looked old, weird. Marissa, arms crossed and leaning against the doorframe, gave a little snort. Maybe it's one of those cult things, like a secret mark or something. She's probably just here for the free donuts, one of the boys muttered, earning a stifled laugh from the group. They watched as Margaret reached for one. Her hand moved slowly, with a kind of care that made everything she did look intentional. She picked up a single donut, placed it gently on a napkin, and walked over to the far side of the room to sit in a chair along the wall, one of the metal ones that never quite sits flat. She didn't join a table. She didn't look up. The teens kept watching her, casting sidelong glances as they sipped their juice from little paper cups. The giggles faded to silence, but the curiosity remained. It was the kind of attention that felt like surveillance, not interest. They were trying to figure her out like a puzzle. They weren't particularly interested in solving only mocking. "She's been coming here for years, right?" one of the boys asked. "I mean, my grandma says she's always at the early service." "Yeah," Kayla said, "but I don't think anyone actually talks to her." "She creeps me out a little," Marissa added. "Always sitting alone, doesn't say anything, like she's watching everything." They didn't notice the deacon, who had paused mid-step near the snack table, overhearing just enough of their conversation to frown slightly before continuing on with his plate of cookies. Margaret sat with her donut untouched, her hands folded neatly on her lap, napkin resting across her knee like a formality. She watched the room with quiet, unreadable eyes. Her lips moved now and then, not speaking, but perhaps humming. Or perhaps just mouthing a hymn that had stayed with her long after the organ stopped playing. When Pastor Emily finally entered, greeting congregants one by one, her eyes caught Margaret's across the room. The pastor smiled. Margaret gave a small nod in return. That was all. The teens didn't notice the exchange. They had already moved on to scrolling through their phones, texting friends who hadn't come, wondering how much longer they had to stay to fulfill their service hours. The energy around them had shifted back to their own world, one where everything made sense and everyone old was just another figure fading into the background. But Margaret remained seated, one hand resting gently over the spot on her wrist, where the ink had long ago begun to blur into her skin. She didn't eat the donut. She didn't rise to mingle. She simply sat, waiting for a room to forget she was there again. The clipboard rested near the entrance to Fellowship Hall, propped up on a metal music stand that had long since lost its original use. A neatly typed heading read, "Altar Flower Sponsorship, May through July." Underneath it, columns were drawn by hand, each dated Sunday, written in careful blue pen. Most spaces were still empty, waiting for someone to sign their name next to a week when they might want to honor a loved one, a birthday, or simply contribute. Margaret moved toward the stand slowly, her fingers brushing the edge of the table. As she passed, the hallway was thinning now, with most congregants drifting toward the parking lot or lingering at the donut table. No one noticed her pause. Her eyes scanned the list with quiet intent. The third Sunday of June was open. That would be close to the anniversary. She reached for the pen tied to the clipboard with a length of fraying yarn. The cap was missing, and the ink had a habit of stalling between strokes. But she wrote her name slowly, Margaret Walsh. Her handwriting was careful, slightly trembling, but legible. She didn't list a reason. Most people did in memory of Mom or for our anniversary. But she left the purpose blank. Behind her, a group of choir members chatted while folding their sheet music into folders. One glanced briefly at the clipboard, noting someone had filled in a date. Who signed up? She asked, not really caring. A mother leaned forward. Looks like Margaret Walsh. The name came out tentative, uncertain. A beat of silence followed. Do we know her? One asked. I don't think so. Is she new? No, she's been here a long time, I think. Always at the early service. Oh, maybe she goes by something else. They shrugged and moved on. The name didn't carry any weight. No face rose in their minds, no memory attached to it. To them, Margaret was just one of the quiet figures who came and went without speaking. No one greeted her by name. When she arrived, no one called her by name when she left. It was written there on the clipboard like a whisper, a name that didn't stir recognition, didn't anchor to a story. Margaret stood for a moment after writing it, her fingers hovering just above the paper as though she were tempted to add something more, a second name, maybe, or a note about why she chose that week. But she didn't. She returned the pen to the holder and moved back down the hallway. Unnoticed, Pastor Emily was speaking with a young couple near the entrance, their baby wrapped in a soft blue blanket. Margaret passed behind them quietly, her footsteps nearly silent on the tile. She paused by the sanctuary doors, looked back once at the clipboard, then walked out. Outside, the sun was bright enough to make her squint. Her trench coat, still buttoned, caught the light awkwardly. A breeze tugged at the corners of her skirt as she stepped slowly toward the sidewalk. The others streamed past her, car doors slamming, engines turning over. A few nodded politely. As they passed, not because they knew her name, but because politeness still clung to Sunday mornings. No one said, "Thank you for signing up." No one said, "Margaret, we haven't seen you in a while." No one remembered the name, though. It had been hers all her life long before it had faded into the background of town records, church rolls, and long-forgotten donation letters. It had been stitched into uniforms, carved into wood, whispered over radios no one used anymore. Inside the church, the clipboard sat quietly. Her name said quietly. But the flowers would be there in June. No one would remember who had placed them, but she would. Pastor Emily always tried to linger a little after the service, not to hover and not out of obligation, but because she'd come to understand that the real conversations, the honest ones, rarely happened during the sermon or the scripted parts of worship. They happened over lukewarm coffee and mismatched chairs near coat racks and bulletin boards when people forgot they were speaking to a pastor. That was when things cracked open. But on this particular Sunday, Emily stood near the coffee table, holding a half-empty cup she didn't plan to finish, eyes scanning the room. The teens were in their usual huddle near the windows, scrolling and murmuring behind shared phones. The choir director was laughing with the organist over something that clearly wasn't church-related. Someone had started collecting folding chairs along the far wall, and in the middle of it, eel off to one side. Near the napkin table was Margaret alone. Margaret was always alone. But something felt different now, and Emily couldn't quite name it. Maybe it was the way the teenagers' laughter spiked when the woman walked by, or how none of the usual small talkers offered her a seat. The old woman had been part of the church longer than most of the current congregation, but still floated through it like a visitor. She came early, left late, and spoke only when necessary. Emily had noticed her during her very first week at Hill. It would have been hard not to. Margaret had sat 3 pews from the front, straight-backed and silent, her hands folded tightly over the bulletin. She didn't sing, she didn't look around, but her eyes never left the pulpit. They'd exchanged a polite hello once, maybe twice, near the coat racks. A soft good morning and a nod. No names offered. Margaret wasn't cold, just distant, like someone watching the world from a step behind it. Emily had assumed at first that she was grieving. She'd seen that kind of quiet in other congregants' widows, especially who wore silence like a second skin. But it had been months now. The quiet hadn't softened. If anything, it had deepened. She sipped her coffee, still watching from the edge of the room. Margaret was seated now near the back wall, facing the table, but not part of it. Her napkin sat untouched on her lap, a single donut still whole in the center. She didn't look bored or impatient, just still. The kids glanced over again, whispered something. Laughed. Emily frowned. She didn't want to overreact. Teens were awkward. They whispered about everyone. But she had been a youth leader once, and she knew the difference between harmless jokes and mean ones. She also knew when someone was becoming the target of a story they hadn't agreed to be part of. She considered walking over, introducing herself properly to Margaret, asking her about the altar flower, sign up she'd noticed the name when she reviewed the clipboard earlier. It had taken her a full minute to connect the handwriting to the woman in pew 3, and even then, she hadn't known much else, but she hesitated. Maybe now wasn't the moment. Margaret didn't seem like someone who appreciated being singled out, so instead, Emily just stood there a little longer, watching the edges of things. She watched how Margaret's eyes tracked the room. Even if she didn't speak, she watched how her left hand, resting gently on her lap, moved occasionally to her wrist, like checking for something that wasn't there anymore. She watched how the teens kept glancing her way, not with fear, but with curiosity too sharp to be respectful. Emily finished her coffee and set the cup down beside the cookies. Then she made a quiet decision, not spoken aloud and not written down. She didn't know who Margaret Walsh had been, but she was going to find out. The folding chairs had mostly been stacked, and the donut table was beginning to clear when Deacon Harold made his usual slow loop around Fellowship Hall. It wasn't an official duty, but after 40 years in the congregation, Harold had made it his business to check on things. He liked to ensure nothing was left unplugged, no hymnals misplaced, no fresh coffee left to sour in the urn. Most Sundays, he did it without fanfare, a quiet sentinel in pressed slacks and a belt that cinched just a little too high. People greeted him with nods and gentle pats on the back. He passed the coat rack, glanced at the table of remaining bulletins, and then noticed Margaret Walsh still seated along the wall. That wasn't unusual. She often waited until the crowd thinned before rising, perhaps to avoid the shuffle of bodies or the questions that never came. What caught Harold's attention this time wasn't her presence, but the glint of something metallic as she reached into her coat pocket. He slowed. The light had caught a bracelet, thin, silver, and aged. At first glance, it seemed like costume jewelry, the sort that older women wore out of habit, but something about it held him there for a moment longer. The charms didn't shimmer or dangle with whimsy. They were small, heavy-looking pieces, none of them matching, none of them decorative in the usual sense. One was shaped like a dagger. One charm had letters on it that didn't look English. Cyrillic, perhaps? Greek, maybe? And another a tiny parachute, perfectly molded, no larger than a nickel hung with deliberate stillness. Harold had served briefly in Germany after the war, stationed at an outpost in He wasn't the type to talk about it much, but the old instincts lingered. He knew the difference between trinkets and emblems. The bracelet Margaret wore wasn't decorative, it was mnemonic, a record. He took a step closer, not out of but out of something else, a vague recollection, a curiosity that pulled at him like a half-remembered tune. Margaret hadn't noticed him yet. Her eyes were on the bracelet too. She was running her thumb lightly across the parachute charm, almost unconsciously, as though checking to make sure it hadn't vanished. "Afternoon, Margaret," he said quietly, pausing a respectful distance away. She looked up slowly. Her face didn't change much. A slight nod. "Harold," she replied, voice even, just checking the room. "I figured," she said, her fingers sliding over the last charm before lowering her hand to her lap. Harold hesitated. It wasn't the kind of thing you brought up casually, not when the air around it felt heavy with something unnamed. But his eyes lingered a second too long. Margaret noticed she didn't flinch, didn't tuck her hand away. Instead, she lifted her wrist slightly, tilting it just enough for the charms to catch the overhead light. "Picked them up along the way," she said softly. Harold gave a quiet nod. "They don't look like tourist souvenirs." "No," she said, "they're not." He waited, but she didn't elaborate. It struck him then how little anyone really knew about her. No one had connected the slight limp in her walk with the discipline of someone trained not to complain. No one had wondered. He just nodded once more, then turned back to his slow circuit of the hall. Behind him, Margaret let her sleeve fall gently over the bracelet, but the air had shifted, just a little. Someone had noticed. The sanctuary felt cavernous on Thursday afternoons, with only the faint light from the high windows slanting in, and the quiet creak of the pews echoing off the stone walls. The organ, usually majestic during Sunday services, had a more vulnerable tone during practice, softer. Exposed, the choir, scattered across the first few pews and chancel steps, was rehearsing one of the older hymns from the back of the hymnal. Pastor Emily had suggested it for the following service. hoping to reintroduce some of the more traditional pieces. The choir director, Linda Carmichael, stood at the front, her reading glasses slipping to the end of her nose. She tapped her pencil against the music stand and called out, "All right, everyone, let's take it from the second verse." Sopranos, watch the timing on Evermore Shall Reign. You're coming in too early. The organist, a soft-spoken man named Bill, began again, his fingers pulling the melody through the pipes like thread. The choir sang, voices rising in uneven harmony. Linda winced slightly. No, you're dragging that last line. It should lift on majesty, not sink." They tried again, this time from the rear pew near the side aisle. A voice spoke up, not loud, not intrusive, but clear enough to silence the room. "That's not how it was written." The organ paused mid-note. The final syllable of the verse hung awkwardly in the air before collapsing into silence. All eyes turned. Margaret Walsh sat alone in the pew, her coat buttoned up as always, hands folded over the same worn bulletin. She never seemed to discard. She wasn't supposed to be there. Choir practice wasn't open rehearsal, but the doors were never locked, and no one had thought to stop her. She often came in on Thursdays, slipping in during the last 10 minutes to sit quietly, listening from the shadows as the choir rehearsed. No one had questioned it. Until now, she had never spoken. Linda blinked, caught mid-page turn. "Sorry," she said, not unkindly, but startled. Margaret didn't move. "The third measure of the second verse," she said evenly. "You've got it ending on a descending E-flat, but it resolves up to sharp to F-sharp. The original publication from 1919 had it notated differently than the revised hymnal. You're using the revision from 1954. The room was silent. Linda looked down at the score, flipping a few pages, then glancing at the copyright notes in the corner. Her lips parted slightly as her eyes traced the staff. "She's right," Bill said softly from the organ bench, squinting at the music. "The lift is in the original arrangement." A few of the choir members shifted in their seats. One of the altos whispered, "How'd she know that?" Margaret said nothing more. She simply returned her gaze to the altar, as if the matter was closed. Linda hesitated, then cleared her throat. "All right, let's try it again, original phrasing this time." Her voice was quieter, as though the weight of the correction lingered, the organ resumed. They sang, and this time the line floated instead of falling. A subtle shift, but one that changed the entire final measure. It felt right, balanced dot, when they finished. Linda looked back toward the pew where Margaret had been sitting, but she was already standing, smoothing her coat. She didn't wait for acknowledgement. She turned slowly and exited down the side aisle. Her footsteps muffled by the carpet, the choir remained silent for a beat. Longer than usual. Did she used to be a music teacher or something? One of the tenors asked quietly. "I don't know," Linda murmured, still staring after her. But that wasn't a guess. That was memory. Margaret didn't look back as she left the sanctuary. She didn't need to. The notes were already behind her, so was the war, so were the secrets. But some things stayed sharp. Even after all that time, the hallway outside the sanctuary was narrow, lined with corkboards layered in curling announcements and photos of pancake breakfasts from years gone by. The overhead lights buzzed faintly. It was quieter here, out of sight from the fellowship hall and far from the altar's calm glow. This was the space people passed through quickly on Sundays, never lingering except now, when the usual current of motion had paused for just long enough to make the silence feel thick. Margaret had just stepped out, her coat buttoned tight. As always, she walked with the steady pace of someone who didn't rush for anyone anymore. She held her hands clasped in front of her, not out of nervousness, but out of long habit. Behind her, sneakers squeaked against tile. A voice called, light, uncertain, but edged with something sharper. Margaret stopped. She turned. Kayla stood a few feet away, arms crossed, posture stiff. The hallway light gave her face an odd pallor, making her look younger than she'd felt. When she'd rehearsed this moment in her head, behind her, Marissa lingered, arms folded, trying to look uninterested, but failing to hide the sideways glance. Margaret didn't speak first. Kayla cleared her throat. She hesitated, then pushed forward. Your wrist, the tattoo. Margaret waited. What does it mean? The silence that followed wasn't hostile, but it wasn't comfortable either. It sat between them like a locked box. Margaret's eyes flicked to the left, down the hall toward the chapel doors. Then she looked back at the girl. She didn't raise her sleeve. She didn't move her hands. "I earned it," she said quietly. "In 1944, that was all." Kayla blinked. The words didn't register right away. She had been expecting something different, maybe a deflection, maybe a joke, but not that. She didn't know what the year meant. Not really. She'd heard about World War II, sure, in the way you hear about anything distant and enormous in school. But she'd never connected it to a single person's body, especially not one walking the same hallways she was in 1944. Kayla echoed, the number sounding suddenly foreign. "What? What do you mean?" Margaret gave her a long look, not unkind, just measured, like someone deciding whether a door should be opened or not. "I mean," she said slowly, "that when you're behind enemy lines, you don't have the luxury of forgetting where you've been. So we marked ourselves in ways that wouldn't wash off." Behind Kayla, Marissa shifted her weight. "Enemy lines?" Kayla asked, her voice quieter. Now, she hadn't meant to start something heavy, but now it was too late to walk away. Margaret didn't explain further. She didn't offer stories. She didn't need to. The hallway seemed to shrink around them for a moment, the weight of history folding itself into the quiet. Kayla looked down, unsure of what she'd expected, maybe an old woman's story suite, harmless. Instead, she'd stumbled into something deeper. She looked back up and found Margaret watching her with eyes that didn't flinch. "Were you in the military?" Margaret's mouth quirked into something that wasn't quite a smile. "There wasn't a name for what we were. Not back then." She stepped past the girls, the heels of her shoes tapping lightly on the floor. Neither of them moved to stop her. At the end of the hall, she paused. She turned slightly over her shoulder. "Don't ask questions unless you're ready to hear answers," she said, voice gentle. Then she disappeared around the corner, her trench coat brushing the wall as she walked. Kayla stood there, still. Marissa finally spoke. "What do you think that means?" Kayla didn't answer. She just stared down the hallway where Margaret had gone, suddenly very aware of how little she knew about anything at all. The sanctuary was emptying slowly, the sounds of hymnals closing and bulletins being folded filling the air alongside the fading hum of the final organ note. The large double doors creaked open and shut in gentle rhythm as people made their way. Into the hallway, their conversations quiet, respectful. But in the back corner of the sanctuary, where the worn carpet had started to separate from the baseboards, the group of teens lingered. They were laughing again. "She really said 1944. One of the boys whispered, his voice thick with disbelief. Though he was smiling too widely for it to be confusion alone, Kayla stood slightly apart from the group now, her arms crossed tightly. "But she didn't say anything." "She walks like this," the boy continued, pushing his shoulders forward and bending at the knees, taking slow, exaggerated steps past the pew. He dragged one foot behind the other, his face set in a mock frown. Laughed. Another boy stifled a snort and mimicked the motion, arms flapping gently like a coat too big for his frame. "Don't forget the trench coat," he said, voice cracking as he tried to keep the volume down. The laughter bounced off the walls in thin echoes, unnaturally loud in the otherwise quiet sanctuary. It rose in bursts, uneven and nervous, like kids who knew they shouldn't be laughing but didn't have the discipline to stop. The building seemed to absorb it in an odd way, amplifying it, stretching it through the pews like a ripple on still water. Near the center aisle, an elderly couple stood side by side, the man holding a folded bulletin in both hands, while his wife adjusted the strap of her purse. They weren't smiling. They turned toward the sound, then toward one another. No words passed between them, but their shared glance was enough. A silent exchange of disappointment. Recognition, too. They had seen something like this before. It never looked different. Further, toward the front, Deacon Harold paused by the altar rail, watching from the side. He didn't interrupt. His hands were in his pockets. His jaw was tight. He had the posture of someone used to waiting for others to decide when to act. The teens didn't notice the stares, or perhaps they noticed and didn't care. "She probably just makes up half that stuff," one boy muttered. "Like, what kind of old lady even says stuff like behind enemy lines?" Kayla looked over then. She hadn't joined the imitation. She hadn't laughed at the coat, but she also hadn't said anything. Now, though her voice came in flat, you didn't see her face when she said it. The others turned. She wasn't joking, Kayla said quietly. She wasn't bragging either. It was like she was remembering something she didn't want to say out loud. For a moment, the group stilled. But only for a moment. Yeah, okay, one of them said, his voice lighter than before, trying to diffuse the tension. But still, that tattoo, the bracelet. She's probably just eccentric. You know how old people get? Behind them, the doors swung shut again. Margaret had exited some minutes earlier, unseen, but her presence still lingered, and the sound of their laughter had chased her shadow down the hallway. No one followed. In the pews, the laughter faded, the walls returned to stillness. But those who had heard it who had lived long enough to recognize what it meant carried it with them, quietly, not because they didn't care, but because they had seen what happened when voices tried to defend someone who never asked to be defended. Margaret Walsh had walked away again, alone, and in her absence, the sanctuary echoed with something heavier than silence. The sanctuary was unusually quiet that morning, even for a Sunday. The early sun poured through the stained glass windows in slanted beams, illuminating dust that danced gently in the still air. The prelude had not yet begun. Hymnals remained closed. Only the shuffle of feet and the soft rustle of coats echoed now and then as people found their usual seats, greeting one another with polite nods and murmured good mornings. Pastor Emily stood near the back of the nave, bulletin in hand, watching the congregation settle. Her eyes moved over the familiar pairings' families sitting in their accustomed pews. Widows in small clusters near the center, the teens clustered further back with that mixture of boredom and vague anticipation. And then, near the front, as always, in pew 3 on the left side, sat Margaret Walsh. She was seated in her usual spot, third in from the aisle. Coat buttoned all the way to the collar, her back straight and hands folded neatly over her lap. Her eyes were fixed on the pulpit, not out of reverence, but habit. There was something in her stillness that made her seem more statue than parishioner present, but untouched by the movement of the room around her. Emily hesitated. She didn't have a plan exactly, just a feeling that had been building for weeks. It wasn't anything dramatic. But the moment she'd seen Margaret alone, and not early alone, despite sitting in the middle of a crowd, she realized that the space beside her had never been occupied in all the time she'd served at. Not once, not by a child, not by a friend, not even by one of the ushers offering communion assistance. That empty stretch of pew might as well have been roped off. She made her way down the aisle as she approached. A few heads turned. Notice quietly, the pastor didn't sit in the pews during the service. Not typically, and certainly not unannounced. But Emily didn't stop. She reached pew 3, stepped in without a word, and sat beside Margaret. The older woman didn't flinch, didn't look over immediately. Her posture didn't change. It was only after Emily placed her folded bulletin on her lap that Margaret spoke, her voice low but perfectly clear. "It's about time someone did." Emily turned her head slightly. "Pardon." Margaret looked at her then, not with a smile, not quite, but with the faintest upward curve of the mouth. Her eyes held. "No surprise, you've been circling," she said, waiting, watching, wondering when to say something. Emily blinked, caught off guard by the quiet accuracy of the words. She opened her mouth, but Margaret cut her off gently. "You're kind," she said, "and you listen. That's more than most, but kindness without courage is just decoration." The prelude began, then soft organ notes drifting from the choir loft above, but Emily hardly heard it. She looked at the woman beside her and realized, with sudden clarity, that she had been seen long before she had made any choice to act. "I didn't want to crowd you," Emily said after a moment. Margaret nodded once. "I know, but sometimes," she said, "what people need most is for someone to sit down anyway." They didn't speak again for the rest of the service. Margaret watched the pulpit as she always did, unmoved. Emily watched her from the side, not out of curiosity anymore, but attention. Real attention. The kind people rarely give to someone they think they already understand. Around them, the service unfolded as it always did. The liturgy, the hymnals, the whispered amens. But something had shifted in that third pew, something almost imperceptible. For the first time in a very long time, Margaret Walsh was not alone. And for the first time, Pastor Emily wasn't leading from the front, but learning from beside. The flyer had been tacked to the bulletin board just inside the fellowship hall, right between the outdated potluck sign-up sheet and a half-torn poster for a community garden project. It was printed in bright blue ink, with rounded letters and an illustration of a steaming mug perched atop an open Bible. Young Adults Bible, studied Tuesdays at 6 p.m. in room 5. All are welcome. Let's grow together. Margaret had passed it twice before stopping to read it properly. She noted the location, the time, the phrasing. All are welcome. It was that line that stayed with her. She read it once more, just to be sure. Then she wrote it down carefully on the inside cover of her bulletin. That Tuesday evening, just as the sun began to lower behind the steeple, Margaret arrived. Room 5 was tucked in the newer wing of the church, with vinyl tile floors and bright fluorescent lights that hummed slightly overhead. The chairs were already arranged in a loose circle, a plate of cookies in the center on a folding table, along with a few open Bibles and highlighters scattered around like casual markers of conversation. The door creaked open gently, and the chatter inside faltered as Margaret stepped in. She wore the same beige trench coat, buttoned all the way up despite the warmth in the building. Her hair was combed neatly, and she carried a small notepad with her, tucked under one arm. She paused in the doorway for just a second, scanning the room with the quiet assessment of someone used to reading a space quickly, and selected a chair. One slightly apart from the circle, but still within it. The room hadn't moved. The age gap was immediate and obvious. Everyone else in the room was somewhere between high school graduation and early careers. Most had come straight from campus or work, still in jeans and hoodies. Margaret sat like an ink drop in a glass. Of water, present, distinct, slowly spreading into something none of them knew how to name. The leader of the group, a soft-spoken seminary student named Jason, cleared his throat. "Hi," he said, voice rising slightly. "Welcome." Margaret gave a small nod. "Good evening." Jason glanced around the circle. A few of the others were fidgeting now, shifting in their seats, avoiding eye contact. The silence stretched. "So, this group is mainly geared toward young adults. We talk a lot about, stuff going on in our phase of life: school, relationships, faith transitions." Margaret watched him steadily dot. He trailed off, then tried again. "But we're always happy to have visitors." "I saw the flyer," she said evenly. "It said, 'All are welcome.'" Jason smiled, but it was the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It did. Yeah, of course. Absolutely." One of the girls coughed softly. Another began to quietly close the cover of her Bible, unsure of what was expected now. Margaret didn't seem fazed. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small pen, clicking at once. She rested the notepad on her lap. "I've been studying scripture longer than most of you have been alive," she said without pride, simply stating a fact. "But I still have things to learn." Jason shifted in his seat, unsure whether to proceed as usual or change course. Another voice, nervous, youthful, spoke from the far end of the circle. "Did you go to this church when you were our age?" Margaret looked at her eyes, softening slightly. "No, I was overseas by then, but I carried a New Testament in my coat pocket every day." The silence that followed was no longer awkward. He fumbled with his notes, read a passage from Philippians, and tried to reestablish the rhythm they'd had before she entered. They went around the circle. Each spoke briefly. When it reached Margaret, she declined with a polite shake of her head. She stayed the full hour, taking occasional notes, speaking only once more to clarify a translation nuance in the text. When the group ended, no one asked her to return. But no one asked her to leave either. As Margaret stepped out into the evening light, the sound of her shoes on the concrete walkway echoed against the side of the building. Jason watched her go from the doorway, hands still in his pockets, wondering if he'd said the wrong thing, or simply not enough. The sanctuary was nearly empty. Just a few lingering members tidying hymnals, collecting bulletins, and wiping down the pewbacks with slow, deliberate care. The late afternoon light spilled through the stained glass, casting pools of muted color. Across the wooden floor, Pastor Emily had stepped out to answer a call, and most of the youth had wandered off to the back lot, where they often gathered to talk and check their phones before heading home. Margaret remained seated in pew 3. As always, she was reading from a small Bible, with pages so thin they made a whispering sound every time she turned one. She held it in her left hand, her right resting on her lap until a persistent itch made her lift her sleeve with the absent-mindedness of someone long used to covering something she had once been forced to explain too many times. The fabric of her coat rose slowly, and for the first time in clear view, the tattoo on her inner wrist was visible. It was not the kind of tattoo one got in a parlor or during a youthful rebellion. The ink was faint now, faded into the pale skin of age. But the lines remained distinct. A dagger, perfectly symmetrical, its blade downward, wings spread out on either side, sharp and geometric. Encircling the whole symbol were letters, characters, not in English, not in cursive, but in blocky, unfamiliar script. The edges had blurred with time, but the shape was unmistakable. From several pews behind, Deacon Harold was stacking hymnals into neat rows when he caught sight of the mark. He wasn't close enough to read it clearly, but the design, especially the wings, him pause. His breath caught lightly in his throat, and without realizing it, he sat down. Margaret didn't notice. She was still scratching lightly, absent-mindedly, before lowering her sleeve back into place. The gesture took no more than a few seconds, but it had been enough. Harold sat still for a moment, blinking slowly. His mind was turning back, far beyond anything related to Sunday services or the day's reading from Corinthians. He'd seen that symbol before, not in person, but once in an old documentary grainy black and white footage showing a group of women in uniform who weren't quite in uniform. No name tags, no countries displayed, just a patch on the shoulder or a mark on the wrist. Some were filing paperwork. Some were parachuting from planes. One was shown setting charges beneath a bridge, all without fanfare, without ceremony. The emblem had been explained only briefly by the narrator, a dagger with wings, used unofficially by certain units within the Office of Strategic Services during the Second World War. The precursor to what the modern world would come to know as the CIA. It was not a tattoo you could request. It was assigned, given only to those who had served under the strictest code of silence. People who carried cameras and maps and small vials of something that wasn't always medicine. People who disappeared into places they weren't supposed to. And then came back, changed. Harold stood slowly and walked toward the side aisle, pretending to tidy a row of forgotten bulletins. He glanced at Margaret again. Her coat sleeve had fallen naturally back into place. Her hands were folded once more, Bible closed and resting. On her lap, she looked calm. Still, he didn't say anything. But that night, Harold went home and pulled out an old book. He kept on a high-shelf one that had pages on wartime espionage and little-known units. He flipped through it until he found the chapter he vaguely remembered. There it was again, the same symbol, same dagger, same wings. No official caption. Just a note in the margin from the author, believed to be used by field agents in Europe, 1943 to 1945, verified only through oral history. Harold stared at the page for a long time. Then he closed the book and sat in silence, hands resting on the cover. Margaret, he now understood, hadn't just lived through history, she had helped shape it, and the mark on her wrist, though quiet and nearly invisible, had more weight than any sermon he'd heard that year. Ask ChatGPT. It started with a question, as it often does in small communities. Someone asked it, not out of malice, but curiosity spoken over lukewarm coffee during cleanup. After Sunday service, did she ever have a husband? No one had an answer, not a real one anyway. What followed instead was a series of theories, offered in half-lowered voices and knowing glances. I don't think she ever did. Well, maybe just once. A long time ago? No ring? No mention of family? No pictures in her wallet, I bet. Some women just prefer to be alone. By the time the conversation reached the foyer, the tone had shifted. Curiosity was replaced by something sharper. I heard she was stationed overseas for years in the Red Cross. No, intelligence maybe. She gives off that vibe, always listening, always watching. And finally, near the coat rack by the fellowship table, a woman in her 60s leaned in and said in a voice that wasn't quite quiet enough, maybe she was just too difficult for any man. Margaret was reaching for her coat at the time. The words hung in the air. She didn't look at the woman who said them, didn't flinch or sigh. She simply buttoned the top clasp, smoothed the front, and turned to leave without comment. But silence, in some rooms, is louder than speech. Later that day, Pastor Emily would hear about the remark secondhand. She'd wince. She would tell herself she should say something next week, maybe address it subtly in a sermon, maybe not so subtly. But by the time the next Sunday arrived, it would be forgotten by the ones who said it, because to them, it was just a passing comment, one of many, but not to Margaret. Margaret walked home that afternoon with the collar of her coat high against the wind. Her steps were measured, her street quiet. Her small brick home stood at the end of a cul-de-sac, surrounded by an unkempt lawn and a porch swing that hadn't moved in years. Inside, the furniture was sparse, functional. The photos on the mantel were not of weddings or grandchildren, but landscapes, black and white images of mountains, bridges, and cities taken from odd angles. A few were marked with small handwritten dates: 1944, 1947, 1952. There were no smiling faces, only memories sealed in film. In a drawer near the writing desk sat an old envelope. Inside it, yellowed with age, was a telegram. The edges were frayed, the ink slightly smudged. She had read it so many times the creases had worn thin. It bore the words she had memorized. Regret to inform. Captain Daniel Greer, killed in action. Italy, July 15, 1944. There had been no ceremony, no newspaper announcement, burial in foreign soil, and the instruction to speak of nothing, ever. The man who had once waited with her in training camps, who had written in the margins of her code books, who once slipped a small ring box into her pocket on a walk between bunkers, was gone before she ever had a chance to say yes. She never told anyone, not even her parents, who assumed she had just gotten over whatever romantic fancy she'd had during the war. They never asked again, not out of shame, but necessity. Her work didn't allow for public mourning. Her future didn't permit it either, so she carried it quietly, efficiently, like a field pack. The years passed. Suitors came and went, mostly during the brief windows when she worked stateside, but she never allowed any to stay. She would smile, sometimes even dance, but the part of her that once belonged to someone had already been given away. Long ago, buried with a name few in her new life would ever know. And so when whispers at church questioned her singleness, when someone labeled her difficult, she felt no need to correct them. They were wrong. But she had no obligation to make them right. Some truths weren't meant to be offered freely. Some were meant to be carried, not displayed. And Margaret Walsh, widow in silence, had carried hers farther than anyone in that church would ever understand. The package came in a plain brown envelope, no larger than a folded newspaper, with no markings beyond the postage and the address typed in a clean, formal font. It arrived on a Thursday, dropped off with the usual church mail newsletters, donation slips, a few handwritten prayer requests. Pastor Emily didn't think anything of it at first. It had no return address, only a barcode and the line: Department of Defense Historical Records, Office. She almost set it aside, but the name caught her EYEM Walsh. She turned it over. There was no first name, no sender's name, and nothing indicating what might be inside. Just that cold, bureaucratic string of print that somehow made everything seem heavier. She ran a finger along the flap, considering her instinct was to open it. Many older members received church-related mail at the office, but something stopped her. She placed the envelope gently on her desk instead, then checked the roster to confirm what she already suspected. There was only one Walsh in the congregation. That Sunday, after service had ended and the congregation had begun its usual post-sermon shuffle toward coffee and conversation, Emily approached Margaret at her pew. "This came for you," she said softly, handing over the envelope. Margaret took it with a quiet nod, studying it only briefly before tucking it under her coat. She didn't open it. She didn't ask what it was. She simply said, "Thank you," and walked away. It wasn't until later that afternoon, alone in her kitchen, with the late light of day painting the floor in amber hues, that Margaret sliced the flap open with the edge of a butter knife. Inside was a document folded with military precision, printed on thick, aged parchment. At the top, in black ink, with a faded seal embossed near the center. It read, "United States Office of Strategic Services, Posthumous Commendation." Her eyes moved steadily down the page. It named operations she'd long assumed had been buried. It listed regions: Vichy France, Northern Italy, Bavaria, codenames she hadn't heard in decades. Missions carried out with forged passports, under moonlight, in train stations where silence was survival. It described the successful relay of enemy troop movements, the safe extraction of a resistance family, the interception of classified communications that altered the outcome of a regional campaign, and at the bottom, it listed her name: Elaine Walsh, service number 282-153972, for acts of extraordinary bravery and operational excellence, carried out between 1943 and 1945 under severe threat, classified assignments, and with no expectation of recognition. It was signed by a Deputy Secretary of Defense, someone she'd never met, whose signature likely adorned hundreds of these long-delayed acknowledgments. There was also a medal. It came in a velvet-lined casemole, dark blue, with a silver insignia etched into the face. It was not meant to be worn, only displayed. Margaret looked at it without reaching for it, her hand resting beside the open box on the table. She had never expected anything like this. The OSS had always told them not to. She closed the case gently and slid the letter back into the envelope, folding it once more like she had so many field reports in the past. There was a strange stillness in the room now. Not pride, not sorrow, just a quiet recognition of a life that had once been lived on the edge of maps. That night, Margaret brought the envelope with her to bed. She didn't frame it, didn't place it on a shelf. She simply rested it on the nightstand beside her reading glasses and the same Bible she had carried since she was 23. She did not pray differently. She did not cry. The next Sunday, she returned to Pew 3 as always, said nothing. But when Pastor Emily walked past her in the aisle, she noticed Margaret had left the envelope still sealed. Now, with a post-it note attached on the pastor's office door, it read in Margaret's small, even handwriting, "You may keep this in the church archives, if you'd like. I won't be needing it." And that was all it said. The church office was quiet, dimly lit by the afternoon sun coming in through the high windows. Pastor Emily had just finished straightening a shelf of hymnals when she noticed Margaret waiting by the door. She wasn't standing, but seated in the wooden chair just outside the office. Ankles crossed neatly, hands folded over her purse. She didn't knock. She just waited calm, composed, as if time no longer applied to her in quite the same way it did to everyone else. Emily stepped forward, unsure whether to speak first. Margaret looked up and gave a small nod, one that didn't ask for permission, only acknowledgement. "I suppose," Margaret said, "you've seen the symbol by now." Emily nodded slowly. "Yes, on your wrist. A few others noticed it too. Some have been asking." Margaret looked down at her sleeve, then slowly rolled it back until the faint outline of the tattoo was visible again. The ink had softened over time, like everything else about her, but it remained legible. The dagger, the wings, the strange lettering around the edge that no one could quite decipher. "I never thought I'd have to explain it again," she said, her voice even and low. "They told us we never would, not unless everything changed." Emily pulled a chair. Beside her, she didn't press, didn't ask for details, only sat close enough to signal she was listening, really listening. It stood for the Office of Strategic Services, Margaret said. The OSS, long before people knew what intelligence work even meant. Before the CIA existed, before most people knew we were even a country that did that sort of thing. She said it like she was recounting a time before paved roads or electricity. Emily raised her eyebrows gently. "So, this was ... wartime," Margaret nodded. "World War II, the European theater. I joined in 1943. I was 21, working at a factory in Maryland. Someone noticed I spoke French and German fluently. They asked if I could keep secrets." Emily smiled faintly. "And could you?" Margaret gave a short laugh. "Better than most," she went on, her words unhurried. "They didn't send you to basic training. They sent you to a room with no windows and asked you questions until you didn't blink anymore. Then they sent you to London with a false passport and a name you'd have to remember even when you were half asleep." Emily listened in silence. "There were others like me," Margaret continued, "men and women, some trained to kill, others to transmit radio codes or forge papers. I memorized maps, hid tiny blades in lipstick tubes, pinned microfilm to the hem of my skirt. I once spent 3 nights in a wine cellar waiting for a contact who never came. She paused there, as if weighing whether to say more. Some of us never came back, she said finally. Some came back, but weren't the same. I didn't talk about it, not with my parents, not with friends, not even in church, especially not in church. Emily glanced at the tattoo again, and the mark, was it part of the uniform? Margaret shook her head. No, it was part of who we were. We earned it after our first mission. Quietly, no ceremony. Just a visit from a commander who said, "You've done your part." This is to remind you. Emily folded her hands in her lap. It reminds you of the mission. Margaret's eyes met hers. No, it reminds you never to speak too much, because what mattered was never your story. It was always the result. The words sat between them for a long moment. Finally, Emily said softly, "So why now? Why tell me this?" Margaret looked toward the window, watching the light shift along the carpet. "Because people are talking," she said, guessing, laughing, filling in blanks with whatever makes them feel clever. But silence doesn't mean nothing happened, and sometimes her voice trailed off before returning, quieter now. Sometimes it helps to have one person know. Emily nodded. "I'm honored." Margaret reached for her sleeve and rolled it back down slowly. "Good," she said. "Then that's enough." It began with a single tab open on Pastor Emily's laptop. The initials OSS had been circling in her mind all week, tugging at something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't just curiosity anymore, felt like responsibility. If Margaret had chosen to trust her with something that, for nearly 80 years, she had kept hidden from the world. The least Emily could do was try to understand the world she had been part of. She typed Office of Strategic Services, Women Operatives into the search bar and hit return. A wall of old black and white photographs filled the screen. Women in sharp uniforms and civilian dresses, eyes direct, faces composed. Some looked impossibly young. Others had the kind of expressions that made age-irrelevant expressions worn by people who had already seen too much, regardless of the number. Beside their name, Emily clicked through an article from the National Archives. It detailed the formation of the OSS during World War II, how it had recruited linguists, typists, resistance fighters, even college students with sharp minds and clean backgrounds. There was mention of camps in Virginia, training in sabotage, encryption, field survival. The names were few. Most were listed by code number or initials. The faces blurred into one another. But then, on the 3rd page of a digital photo collection, Emily froze. It was a grainy photograph, poorly lit, taken in what looked like a temporary barracks or field office. A group of 6 women stood shoulder to shoulder, some smiling faintly, others expressionless. But one of them, second from the right, stood taller than the rest. She wore a dark wool coat buttoned to the collar. Her hair was pinned back severely, and on the left side of her lapel was a small, round pin. Emily zoomed in. It was a compass, tiny silver, with a barely visible North Point arrow etched into the center. The kind of thing one might mistake for originalist. You had seen the real version before. Because Margaret wore the same one, Emily remembered it clearly now. She had noticed it the first time she sat beside her in the pew. It had been attached to the lapel of Margaret's faded coat, so subtle it blended with the fabric. She'd assumed it was a sentimental trinket, maybe something her late parents had given her. But now, staring at the identical pin on a wartime operative's coat, Emily realized it had been more than sentiment. It had been instruction, orientation, identity. She checked the photo caption. There were no names, only the date April 1944 and a location, Algiers. Emily leaned back in her chair. The woman in the photo couldn't be much older than 23, and yet she had the same posture, the same eyes that didn't flinch. From the lens, eyes that had already decided they didn't owe anyone a smile. There was something else. A note in the margins of the archive entry listed aliases, operational code names. One of them was listed as Vesper, another Gretel, and then one that made her pause, Agent Sparrow C. Ref. 239B. Sparrow. Emily stared at it, her mind flickering back to Margaret's quiet tone in the church office. They asked if I could keep secrets, she'd said. Better than most. She jotted down the reference number and bookmarked the page. Her hands were steady, but her breath had quickened. She wasn't chasing trivia anymore. She was connecting the outline of a life deliberately hidden, line by line. Later that evening, she returned to the photo again, watching the way the woman marked if it truly was her stood among the others. Not apart, but not quite embedded either, like someone who knew how to disappear in plain sight. Emily closed her laptop slowly. There was so much the church community didn't know about the quiet woman in Pew 3, not just because she hadn't told them, but because they hadn't thought to ask. They had seen an elderly woman with a faded coat and assumed the rest, but beneath that coat was a compass pin. And beneath that, a name no one knew how to pronounce anymore. Not Margaret, not Mrs. Walsh, not even Ma'am. Just Sparrow. Kayla hadn't meant for it to go beyond idle curiosity. She wasn't proud of taking the photo, but it hadn't felt cruel at the time. Margaret had been reaching for her coat in the fellowship hall, and the sleeve of her blouse had ridden up. Slightly, the tattoo had caught the light just long enough for Kayla to snap a picture on instinct. A jagged dagger with wings, circled by strange looping characters. It was unlike anything she'd seen before. She hadn't shown it to the others. Not yet. Something about it didn't feel right. That weekend, she visited her grandfather, a retired intelligence officer who now spent most of his days in a sunlit den filled with old maps, brass compasses, and history books. He could quote by chapter. He still walked with a soldier's posture, even though his knees complained with every step. To Kayla, he was just Pops, stoic, exacting, but always kind in his way. She figured he might be able to decipher the tattoo, or at least guess its meaning. She didn't expect much. Over breakfast, as he stirred cream into his coffee, Kayla pulled out her phone. "Hey Pops, do you recognize this symbol?" She rotated the screen toward him. He looked casually at first, squinting slightly. Then he blinked, that his hand jerked. The mug slipped, tumbling sideways off the table and shattering on the linoleum. Coffee spread like a fast-moving shadow across the floor. Kayla scrambled for paper towels, startled. "It's okay, I'll clean it. What happened?" But her grandfather wasn't looking at the mess. He was staring at the phone. His face had gone still, his eyes locked in a kind of shocked recognition that Kayla had never seen before. "Where did you get that?" he asked. "It's someone from my church," she said carefully. "She's older. Her name's Margaret Walsh." He leaned back in his chair slowly, like gravity had just returned to the room. "Are you sure that's her name? That's what she signs on the flower chart and stuff? Why do you know her?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he pushed the phone gently aside, hands folded together on the table. "I haven't seen that tattoo since the early 70s, he said quietly. "Maybe before." Kayla sat down again, her voice now hushed to match his. "What is it?" He looked her in the eye. "That's OSS, Office of Strategic Services. Precursor to the CIA. That tattoo only a handful of operatives ever had one. It wasn't standard. It wasn't decorative. It was a field mark, approved under special circumstances. Some didn't want dog tags. This was their ID." Kayla's brow furrowed. "But she's just a church lady. I mean, she's nice, a little quiet. Most people think she's weird." Her grandfather's jaw tightened. "She's not weird. She's invisible on purpose. That mark wasn't given lightly. I remember an instructor once told me about a woman agent in France who ran messages through Vichy checkpoints under the guise of selling lace. She carried cyanide capsules in a hollowed-out shoe heel. She once disarmed a Gestapo officer using a penknife and a hair comb. He said the only reason she survived the war was because she didn't trust anyone ever it ended." He paused. "Her name was never recorded. Just her codename, Sparrow." Kayla stared. He met her gaze. "You said Margaret Walsh, right?" "Yeah." He shook his head slightly. "If she's who I think she is, she was one of the best. One of the ones history never thanked properly. And if she's in your church, sitting alone in the pews, I'd be careful how people talk to her, or about her." Kayla was quiet. The memory of the snickers, the jokes, the mocking walk imitations suddenly felt like they belonged to a different lifetime, one she didn't want to claim anymore. Her grandfather reached down, picked up the broken mug fragments, and dropped them in the sink without another word. Then he turned to Kayla again. "Next time you see her," he said gently, "tell her an old man from Fort Meade remembers the night train to Lyon. She'll know what that means." Kayla nodded slowly. And for the first time in days, she didn't feel like a child trying to understand something too big. She felt like a witness to something real, something hidden in plain sight. The fellowship hall smelled faintly of overbrewed coffee and lemon-scented floor polish. Folding tables were draped in floral cloths, and the usual collection of store-bought cookies sat in their plastic trays. It was a quiet Sunday, the kind where conversation hovered gently just above a whisper, with nods replacing full sentences. Margaret stood near the back, her coat still buttoned, one gloved hand clutching a styrofoam cup. She hadn't planned to say anything, she never did. Most weeks, she simply stood, waited, and listened, letting the noise pass over her like wind over stone. But something was different today, not with the giggle-laced amusement of a teenager seeking entertainment, but with a quiet, respectful focus that Margaret hadn't seen in decades. The girl approached her, slowly, not flanked by her usual group of friends. She had a plate of cookies in her hand, and no trace of the earlier bravado. Margaret looked at her, then looked away. "Hi, Ms. Walsh," Kayla said softly. Margaret raised one eyebrow. "Most kids don't bother with the Ms. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for the way people have been acting. The world's been rude longer than you've been alive, dear. That might have been the end of it." But Kayla didn't leave. She hesitated, then tried again. "My grandpa saw your tattoo," she said quietly. He said people like you didn't get recognized much." The sound in the hall shifted slightly. A few nearby conversations tapered off, not fully silent, but enough for the space to feel thinner. Margaret set down her cup, still half full. Her fingers didn't tremble, though Kayla noticed they seemed rigid, like they were trained to stay steady even when the rest of the body might falter. "I helped resistance fighters in Lyon." She were talking about a trip to the post office. Kayla blinked. "You were in France?" Margaret gave a short nod. "Spring of '44. We dropped in at night. Never knew exactly where we'd land. The man who packed our parachutes had one good eye and a tendency to hum opera. We called him Vivaldi." A woman 3 feet away, spooning powdered creamer into her coffee, suddenly paused mid-stir. Another man across the table set down his paper napkin a little too slowly. A quiet shifted through the air. "There was a bakery near the Rue des Margaret continued, run by a woman named Odette. She sold crusty loaves with secret notes baked inside." Kayla said. "Nothing. She wasn't sure she was supposed to. I ran messages, sometimes across the countryside, sometimes just across the street. Dressed as a maid, a nurse, once even as a grieving widow. That one got me past a checkpoint. Grief makes people look away. She didn't raise her voice, didn't perform. The story came out with the efficiency of someone reciting instructions. Wrote it into a nursery rhyme, so I wouldn't forget." She glanced around and gave a thin, dry smile. "After the war, I went home. Took a job as a typist. No one asked what I did during the war, so I didn't tell them. Everyone was too busy moving on." The room had gone completely still now. Even the ever-chattering widows near the bulletin board were quiet. Margaret lifted her cup again. "But I suppose things have a way of surfacing. Maybe I got tired of pretending I'd only lived half a life." She took another sip, then quietly added, "Or maybe someone finally asked the right question." She turned away after that and left her cup on the table. The church basement hadn't been visited much in recent years. It was mostly used now for storage old choir robes and garment bags, yellowed nativity props, cardboard boxes of outdated Sunday school materials. The fluorescent bulbs flickered faintly overhead, casting long, inconsistent shadows. The furnace gave its usual rattling cough every few minutes, the kind of sound that people upstairs stopped noticing long ago. It was Greg Coleman, a longtime congregant in his 70s, who first made the connection. He'd been a boy during the war, barely 7 when his mother brought him to the basement on Wednesday afternoons. The memory came back slowly, triggered, not by a sermon or a photograph, but by Margaret's mention of Lyon. He'd heard her say it during coffee hour, a passing remark about resistance fighters and bread. And suddenly, he remembered his mother had called it the war room, though there was no combat in it, just women in aprons, working around folding tables. Margaret had been one of them, he was certain. Her hair had been pinned in the same tight bun, even back then. He remembered her quiet voice, her precise hands as she wrapped bandages into bundles, her ability to do things without being asked or praised. The next day, Greg brought it up to Pastor Emily. She listened carefully, nodding slowly. "I didn't know," she said. "I knew the basement had been used for storage and a few storm drills, but I didn't know it had wartime history. It wasn't official, I think," Greg said. Just what needed to happen. Supplies came in and out. I don't think most of the men even knew. That afternoon, they descended into the basement together. Emily brought a flashlight. Even though the overhead bulbs still worked barely, they walked past stacks of old hymnals and folded metal chairs. Near the back wall, behind a row of broken filing cabinets, Greg pointed to a corner where the paint had peeled from water damage. That's where they packed crates. I remember brown paper, twine, labels that weren't in English. Emily crouched beside a dusty box and peeled back its lid. Inside were bundled linens, still folded, still bearing the faded Red Cross emblem. Beside it was a notebook, the paper brittle at the edges, but the ink still legible. Most of the entries were simple supply counts. Gauze rolls, 14. Wool blankets, 7. Names were rarely included, just initials, but a few times in neat cursive, one name appeared. M. Walsh. Emily flipped through page after page. The handwriting was consistent, the dates spanning from March 1943 to October 1945. Notes about shipments to field hospitals, ration kits, water purification tablets. Some lines were written in French. Others included codes she didn't immediately understand. On one page, a phrase stood out. "Leave nothing in the crate that you couldn't carry in a hurry." Emily looked up. Why would she come here? Why this church? Greg ran his hand along the edge of the wooden table. "I don't think it was the church," he said. "I think it was the work." This was the one place she could still serve quietly without anyone asking too many questions. They found more that day labels in German, a tin of expired iodine, even a small wooden box marked with the insignia of the Office of Civilian Defense. But it was the presence of Margaret's name, buried in the margins, that felt most revealing. She had been there all along, not just as a worshiper, but as a worker. A woman used to moving beneath notice, even in her own congregation. Later that week, Emily approached Margaret about it gently. Margaret just smiled faintly, as if it had all been a matter of course. "I always preferred cellars to boardrooms," she said. "Less noise, more purpose." Emily asked if she'd mind if the basement was cleaned up and possibly turned into a small exhibit, something to honor its past role and her part in it. Margaret looked around the fellowship hall, then back at Emily. "Just make sure the compass points north, and don't call it a museum. Call it what it was, a quiet room where women did what needed doing." Then she picked up her tea and walked away. It was a cloudy Wednesday, one of those days where the sky looked like it hadn't decided whether to rain or simply sulk. Prayer group had just begun in the sanctuary, a small gathering of regulars, 8 women, 3 older men, and pastor. Emily seated in a circle of folding chairs. Margaret, as always, sat near the back, quietly listening. She never volunteered to lead prayer. She didn't take notes. She simply attended, present, but never drawing attention. Halfway through a reading of the day's devotion, the sound of tires on gravel broke the rhythm. Outside the stained glass windows, a dark gray sedan pulled slowly into the parking lot. Not a flashy car, no government tags, just plain, clean, and deliberate. No one paid it much mind at first. Visitors weren't uncommon, and the church had recently posted signs inviting newcomers to prayer meetings. But when the doors opened and 2 men stepped out, one tall, silver-haired, in a conservative navy suit, the other, younger, close-cropped hair, also in a dark suit with polished shoes, it changed the air. They didn't walk toward the main entrance. They moved quietly down the side path, toward the fellowship hall doors, the ones rarely used on Wednesdays. Pastor Emily noticed first. Through the hallway window, she saw them approach the building, not with urgency, but with unmistakable purpose. She rose from her chair without explanation and stepped out of the room. The others murmured, unsure if something had gone wrong. Margaret remained seated, hands gently clasped in her lap, as if nothing had changed. Emily met the men in the hallway. She didn't recognize them, but their posture, their quiet manner, and the faint bulge of what was likely a badge beneath a blazer spoke volumes. Before she could speak, the older man smiled politely and said, "We're here to see Ms. Walsh." Emily blinked Margaret. "Yes, ma'am," the younger one replied. "Is she available?" They didn't offer credentials. They didn't need to. Something about them didn't ask permission. Emily nodded slowly. This way, she led them. Into the room quietly. Conversations stopped when the men entered. People turned, no one spoke. The suits weren't flashy, but they stood out in a room of denim jackets, shawls, and worn leather Bibles. Margaret looked up, then rose with surprising ease for a woman of her age. Her eyes flicked from one man to the other, and she gave a nod, but unmistakably familiar, like recognizing someone from a place long left behind. "Ms. Walsh," the older man said, extending his hand. She took it. One shake. No words at first. The younger man leaned in slightly, said something no one else could hear. Margaret nodded again. Then, for the first time in as long as anyone could remember, she smiled. Not the faint, polite one she used when handed a bulletin. Subtle, yes, but genuine. They spoke for maybe 30 seconds. Whatever was said didn't raise voices, didn't invite attention. It was quick, clipped, and private. Then both men shook her hand again this time more formally and turned to leave. No documents exchanged hands, no ceremony, just a quiet interaction that ended as quickly as it began. The room remained frozen until the sound of the car backing out reached the windows. Only then did conversation slowly resume, but now with a murmur of questions beneath it all. Who were they? Did you see that handshake? Was that the FBI? Margaret sat back down and folded her hands again. When someone asked her half-jokingly, "Old friends of yours?" she simply replied, "Old colleagues." They just remembered something, nothing more. Pastor Emily returned to her seat, the scripture reading forgotten. She watched Margaret. From across the room, this woman who had served communion, unpacked boxes, and corrected hymns, a woman who had somehow arranged her life so well that even the extraordinary could pass quietly, politely, without fuss. The only other detail anyone noticed was a faint mark on one of the men's suit lapels. A small pin, shaped like a compass rose. Not flashy, not military issue, but someone later recalled seeing a similar design on the charm bracelet Margaret wore on Sundays. No one asked again. No one laughed anymore. From that day on, when Margaret entered a room, chairs were pulled, doors were opened, and silence fell not from obligation, but from something closer to respect. It was a Sunday like any other, at least in appearance. The sky outside the chapel was pale and overcast, the kind that made colors look faded and time feel slower. The parking lot filled gradually, the way it always did, haphazard lines, familiar. Engines, the soft clink of heels and loafers on the pavement. Inside the sanctuary smelled faintly of lilies and old hymnals. The choir rehearsed softly in the background. The ushers handed out bulletins with practiced ease. No one said anything beforehand. There were no phone calls, no church emails, no official notice from the pulpit. But somehow, they all knew Margaret arrived exactly when she always did, 15 minutes before the start of the service, a folded umbrella in one hand, her coat neatly buttoned, her steps slow but purposeful. Her shoes made a quiet scraping sound across the tiled floor of the foyer. She paused to wipe one foot before continuing down the aisle, her purse tucked tightly under her arm. What happened next didn't feel coordinated. It felt instinctual. The first to rise was Deacon Simmons, seated 3 rows in, a tall man with a voice that used to carry over auction crowds. He didn't make eye contact, just rose slowly, removing his cap and lowering his gaze. Then one of the Sunday school teachers followed suit, then a teenager near the back, then another. The choir stopped mid-practice, their voices falling away not from confusion but from clarity, row by row, seat by seat. The congregation stood, not abruptly, not ceremoniously. There was no clapping, no fanfare, not even a word, just movement, like a tide, as if some unseen signal had been passed. Margaret didn't falter. She didn't stop to ask. She kept walking down the center aisle, her pace steady, her chin slightly raised. But something in her shoulders shifted barely, a soft, almost imperceptible easing, as if a weight she'd carried so long had finally found a place to rest. Her usual seat in the third pew was empty, as always. People had learned to leave it be. She reached it, set her purse down gently, and lowered herself into place. Only then did the others sit. Pastor Emily stood quietly at the pulpit, watching her sermon notes forgotten on the lectern. For a long moment she didn't speak. She simply allowed the silence to hold. No one looked at their watches. No one whispered. The service resumed eventually. Hymns were sung, scriptures read. But everything carried a different weight. Like the notes rang fuller, the pauses deeper. People listened more than usual. They seemed to sit straighter, breathe slower. During announcements, the church secretary hesitated over the final line. On her paper, she glanced at Margaret, then folded the sheet without reading it. Later, people would learn it had been a reminder to bring baked goods for the youth fundraiser. It suddenly felt too small to mention after communion. As people returned to their seats, some chose to pass by Margaret's pugest close enough to nod, or offer a brief touch on the shoulder. She accepted them all with a quiet dignity, never rising, never speaking. There were no apologies. None were asked for, but in the hush that followed, something had shifted. The whispers were gone, the sideways glances erased. The odd bracelet, the tattoo, the old coat, they no longer sparked curiosity. They were simply part of her now, a truth no longer hidden. After the benediction, the sanctuary remained half full for nearly 20 minutes. No one rushed to leave. Some stood and lingered, watching Margaret as she slowly gathered her things. One of the teens, Kalo, approached with a coat she'd retrieved from the foyer, draping it gently over Margaret's arm. Margaret nodded in thanks, then made her way toward the exit. This time, no one turned away. Every pair of eyes followed, respectfully, quietly. And when the doors finally closed behind her, the silence inside lingered a little longer. Not awkward, not empty, just full of something that had been missing for far too long. It was midweek when Mrs. Roberts came to the church office. She didn't call ahead. She didn't ask for help carrying the box. She simply appeared just after noon, her arms wrapped tightly around a worn wooden crate that looked older than she was. The receptionist offered to help, but she declined, saying only, "It belongs here now." Pastor Emily was in her office preparing Sunday's reading when she heard the knock. She opened the door to find Mrs. Roberts, Margaret's neighbor, of nearly 2 decades, standing there, short of breath but purposeful. "I didn't want to bring this until I was sure," Mrs. Roberts said, "but I think it's time." She placed the box gently on the table, careful not to scrape the wood. The lid was hinged, secured by a brass latch dulled by age. A faint initial had been carved into the front corner, MWO. The letters were shallow, as if etched with a penknife by someone who didn't want to leave much behind. "I found it in the attic. She asked me to hold on to it after the last storm said the church's roof might outlast her own, told me not to open it unless she stopped attending." "But she's still here," Emily said softly. "She's here," Mrs. Roberts replied, "but people see her now." That was the real condition. Emily sat beside the box and opened the latch. It gave a dry click, and the lid creaked as it rose. Inside was a stack of carefully arranged items. Everything had been wrapped in linen or tissue, protected from dust and time. The top layer held an old uniform, dark green wool, with faintly sewn initials on the inner collar. The buttons bore no country's emblem, only a star inside a circle. Pinned to the lapel was a small insignia Emily recognized now, the same winged dagger etched on Margaret's tattoo. She ran her fingers gently along the fabric, worn thin but not damaged. Beneath it lay a narrow velvet case. Inside were 5 medals, unpolished, each tucked into its own groove. The ribbons had faded, but the medal still held its shape. One was a Croix de Guerre French. Another bore the Eagle of the U.S. Army, but not in the standard pattern. Emily recognized a third from her readings about the OSS, a commendation once awarded to field agents who had completed covert operations behind enemy lines. Beneath, the medals were paper pages of strange numbers, coded entries, and short letters, signed only with initials. Some were on parchment marked with foreign stamps. Others were typed on thin carbon paper, the ink now faint. One document had been marked declassified in red block letters, dated 1984. The narrative was brief and clinical. Margaret Walsh. Field asset, deployments in France and Italy, liaison with local resistance, signals expertise. Extraction under duress. Tucked into the bottom corner of the box was a faded photograph. It showed 6 women in fatigues, standing in front of a radio. Array? All were smiling, but only one looked directly at the camera, Margaret. She was young, her eyes alert and posture sharp. She held a folded map in one hand and wore a wristwatch identical to the one she still wore every Sunday. Emily sat in silence. Mrs. Roberts remained by the door. "I asked her once why she never threw that box out," the older woman said. "She said some stories don't belong in books. They belong in attics, quiet ones." Emily closed the lid gently. Would she be okay with us sharing this? Mrs. Roberts nodded. She never said so. But she never said not to, and lately she's been less afraid of being seen. They left the box in the church office for now, placed gently under the glass cabinet that once held outdated hymnals. It would stay there until the church decided what to do, until Margaret decided, more likely later. That evening, Pastor Emily walked the box into the sanctuary. She didn't announce it. She simply placed it on the communion table, still closed, and let the silence surround it. That Sunday, Margaret saw it. She paused, met Emily's eyes, and gave a small nod. Then she walked to her pew and sat, hands folded, as always. But her coat sleeve was rolled back just enough to show the mark beneath. No one laughed, no one whispered. The box had done what? Margaret never asked for, but quietly earned clarity without spectacle, proof without needing permission. It happened between the second and third slices of pound cake, the kind brought every Sunday by Mrs. Calhoun in a tinfoil tray with wax paper folded just so. The fellowship hall was buzzing, as usual, coffee cups clinking, small talk about the coming bake sale, gentle jokes about parking spots. Margaret sat near the window, her teacup balanced on a saucer, both hands wrapped around it, not drinking, but listening. She always listened. The youth group had gathered loosely near the kitchen, pretending to organize napkins, but mostly keeping one eye on her. They weren't whispering anymore. Not exactly. The mood had shifted since the Sunday everyone stood, since the box arrived, since the bracelet had names they couldn't pronounce, and the tattoo wasn't a biker symbol, but something older, stranger, and harder to define. Kayla, the one who'd laughed once without thinking, and then felt the shame, linger all week, was the one who stepped forward. She walked slowly across the hall, past folding chairs and sugar bowls, until she was standing just across from Margaret's table. The others watched, some curious, some nervous, none brave enough to follow. Margaret looked up, her face calm, eyes steady. She didn't smile, but she didn't frown either. She waited. "Double quotes, Mrs. Walsh," Kayla began, her voice quiet but not timid. Were you a spy?" The words hung there like steam off a kettle, fragile, visible, and impossible to ignore. Margaret didn't answer right away. She studied the girl's face, not rudely but thoroughly. There was no mocking in the tone, no sarcasm in the question, just curiosity, raw and unfamiliar. The kind people rarely earn from the young, unless they do something truly unexpected. After a moment, Margaret set her teacup down. She rested her elbows lightly on the table and folded her hands. "I was a woman," she said evenly, "who didn't wait to be told I could do something." Kayla blinked, unsure if that was a yes or a no. Margaret leaned back in her chair, her gaze softening just a touch. There were no titles for it back then, not the way there are now. No badges, no TV shows. There were tasks, missions, people who needed things done, quietly, and people who volunteered because they didn't like what they saw happening to the world. The teen nodded, still processing. "I wasn't chasing danger," Margaret continued, "but I wasn't running from it either. I knew Morse before I knew how to set a table properly. I could hold my breath long enough to swim beneath docks in the dark, and I could disappear into a crowd if the moment called for it. I wasn't special. I was trained. That's the difference." Kayla's eyes widened slightly. "So you helped win the war?" Margaret gave a dry chuckle, barely audible. "No one person ever wins a war, dear. But I helped a few people survive. That's enough for me." The room had gone quieter, not silent, but hushed. More people were listening now, pretending not to look. Pastor Emily stood near the coffee urn, watching like a librarian who doesn't want to interrupt the page turning. Kayla looked down at her shoes for a second, then back up. "Why didn't you tell anyone before?" Margaret glanced out the window. The branches of the oak tree outside swayed in the breeze. "Because when you tell someone something like that too soon," she said, "they only hear what they're ready to understand." And for a long time, people weren't ready to understand. A woman could do the things I did and come home to no medals, no parades, and still be fine with that. Kayla nodded slowly. I think I think they're ready now." Margaret looked back at her. There was no triumphant smile, no dramatic nod, just a subtle acknowledgement, the kind that says, "We'll see." "Then it's your turn," she said, gently, "to choose what you do before someone tells you you're allowed." Kayla didn't say anything more. She just smiled, turned, and walked back to the others, who parted slightly to let her through. No one joked, no one laughed. They just looked over at the woman in the trench coat, sitting quietly at her table as if she hadn't just opened a door no one had dared to knock on. Later, as people filtered out and Margaret gathered her things, someone held the door open for her, not out of obligation, but because it seemed like the right thing to do. The sanctuary was still as the morning sun slanted through the high windows, casting long beams across the worn wooden pews. Pastor Emily stood behind the pulpit with her notes folded in half, untouched. She hadn't written a sermon in the traditional sense this week. Not because she lacked inspiration, but because the story was already in the room, and all she needed to do was give it air. She opened her Bible, but didn't read from it right away. Her eyes lifted to the congregation. They were the same faces she saw each week: mothers adjusting toddlers on their hips, retirees folding their hands, teens trying not to look bored. And Margaret, seated in her usual pew near the front, was looking at her with the same patient calm she always did. Margaret didn't blink often when she listened. She just held your gaze like she already knew how the sentence would end. Emily began slowly, her voice steady but quiet. "Some of the most important work ever done," she said, "was done in silence." There was a small rustle in the room, uncrossing their legs, another turning a page in the bulletin, but mostly, the silence held, not heavy, just present. "We tend to celebrate the loud moments," she continued. "The speeches, the breakthroughs, the declarations. But history, it doesn't always move with a bang. Sometimes it shifts quietly by hands that never claimed credit, by people whose names don't make it into the headlines." A few heads nodded. Margaret sat motionless. Emily walked around the pulpit now, just a few steps forward, not to be dramatic, but to be closer. "I've been thinking about what it means to carry something no one else sees. A burden, yes, but sometimes a legacy. A truth too complicated to explain at the wrong time. A choice made long ago that shaped more lives than anyone realizes." There was a stillness in the room now, not of confusion, but of recognition. People glanced across aisles. Someone reached for their spouse's hand. One of the teenagers, Kyla, sat up a little straighter in the back. "We talk about humility a lot," Emily went on, "but I think we forget what it actually looks like. It's not just stepping aside, it's doing something difficult, something dangerous even, and then returning home quietly, hanging up the coat, folding it away, and never asking to be seen differently." Her gaze drifted to the front, only briefly. Margaret didn't flinch. "It's easy to honor people when they're gone," she said. "But what about those who are still among us? Still walking beside us every Sunday, still pouring their coffee, smiling politely, never interrupting?" The words settled into the space between the pews. No one was shifting anymore. Even the children were unusually quiet. Emily returned to her place behind the pulpit, her hands resting lightly on either side of the open Bible. "I won't name anyone today," she said, "because those who deserve the most honor are often the ones who would ask us not to." A pause, "But I will say this. When you see someone whose life you think you've already figured out, look again, ask gently, listen more, because the stories we don't know are often the ones that shaped the very ground we're standing on." She closed the Bible softly, and remember, she said, legacy isn't always loud. Sometimes it's folded into a drawer, or stitched into the lining of a coat, or marked on the wrist in ink that never fades. There was no applause. It wasn't that kind of sermon, just a long, meaningful silence, the kind that makes people linger in their seats a little longer, unsure why they don't want to leave just yet. Margaret stood when it was time to go, gathering her purse slowly. Several people nodded to her that morning, not out of pity or novelty, but with the quiet understanding that they had finally begun to see what had always been there. She didn't speak to Pastor Emily that day, but as she passed by, she placed a folded slip of paper on the corner of the pulpit. On it was a single line, handwritten in tight script. Silence wasn't shame, it was duty. Emily tucked it into her Bible and said nothing. Some messages were meant to be heard once and remembered forever. The folding chairs in Fellowship Hall had been arranged in 2 uneven rows, a little too close to the screen. As always, a coffee urn gurgled near the back, and someone had brought oatmeal raisin cookies that sat untouched while paper plates bent gently in the warmth of the room. A slide projector hummed on a rolling cart, an old model with a finicky focus dial and a single bulb that had survived 2 decades of church use. They called it Veterans Night, but the crowd was small familiar faces, a few curious teenagers, and the same elderly couple who attended every event out of principle. Most assumed it would be like past years, grainy black and white photos, a story about a grandfather's uniform, maybe a flag folded too many times to hold its shape. No one expected Margaret to speak. She hadn't volunteered. It was Pastor Emily who had asked, not with pressure, not with ceremony, just a quiet suggestion offered after the sermon on silence. And Margaret had nodded once. In that way she did when she had already decided before you'd even asked. She stood beside the cart, her trench coat folded neatly over the back of a chair, her gray cardigan buttoned at the wrist. Her hands were steady, and when she reached down to change the slide, the motion was practiced, even graceful. The first image clicked onto the screen a photo of a narrow stone bridge, the kind found in rural France, with ivy crawling along the guardrails, and water just barely visible beneath. Margaret's voice didn't tremble. It didn't rise or fall for effect. It simply moved forward. That was the first one, she said. Sabotaged the supports with thermite. Timed it to collapse just after the convoy passed. Someone in the back coughed softly. A few heads turned. Next slide, a set of forged papers appeared, identification cards, ration booklets, a child's school certificate altered with precise handwriting and rubber stamps. I made those in a basement outside. Lion, Margaret said, had to mix the ink myself. We used onion paper for overlays. It wasn't perfect, but it passed. The third slide showed a group of men in dark coats standing outside a crumbling chapel. One man was holding a bicycle, another wore a fedora. Their faces were blurred slightly, whether from age or motion. I never knew all their real names, she said. Safer that way. We lost 2 of them the following week. A hush fell over the room, not because the content was shocking, but because it didn't come with explanation or commentary. Margaret didn't speak like someone retelling a story. She spoke like someone remembering a job. Slide after slide followed, a map with hand-drawn arrows, a burned-out safe house, a coded letter written on the back of a grocery receipt, and then, without warning, a photo of a much younger Margaret seated on a park bench, looking off to the side. Her hair was pinned in place, her coat too large, her hands gloved. That was taken by accident, she said. I was supposed to meet a contact who never showed he was captured the night before. No one asked questions. Not yet, toward the end. She paused on a photo of a small church stone walls, wooden doors, flowers growing wild along the edges. It looked oddly familiar. That's the building this church was modeled after, she said. The original was destroyed in 1944. We sent aid after supplies, letters, names. They couldn't say out loud. There was a soft murmur, but still no one interrupted. She ended the presentation with no summary, no call to remember, just turned off the projector, the light fading slowly into the screen's blank surface. The room remained still. One of the teens, a boy named Marcus, raised his hand. It was awkward, like he was in class. How did you learn to do all that? Margaret tilted her head, thinking, they gave me a knife and a radio, she said, and then they stopped telling me what not to do. A few people laughed quietly, unsure if they should. She sat down. Pastor Emily thanked her without ceremony. The cookies remained mostly untouched, but the coffee was poured with a different kind of reverence. People lingered longer than usual. Some asked gentle questions, others simply touched her hand or nodded. No one talked about the projector or the slides again that night. But the next Sunday, 3 more veterans showed up to the morning service. They didn't say why. They didn't need to. The envelope was yellowed at the corners, held closed by a faded blue ribbon that looked delicate enough to fray if pulled too sharply. Margaret untied it carefully, her fingers remembering the folds even after all these years. The room was small. Pastor Emily to curious teens from the youth group, and Mrs. Carver from the church's archive committee, who had volunteered to help catalog Margaret's box of old belongings. Margaret sat at the round table in the back of the library. Her back straight, despite the wooden chair's lack of comfort. The box sat in front of her, and inside it were things that seemed ordinary at first glance. Old newspapers, cloth patches, scraps of maps with corners missing, and then the letters, 24 of them, wrapped tightly and sealed away for decades. "They look like love letters," said Kayla, one of the teens. "Were they?" Margaret smiled, but it wasn't the soft, wistful kind. It was the smile of someone who had kept a secret long enough to know when to reveal just enough of it. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into the box and pulled out a small amber glass bottle with a glass rod attached to the cap. "It's lemon juice," she said. "Not for tea, for ink." Pastor Emily leaned forward slightly, watching as Margaret dabbed the tip of the rod onto the paper. It left a faint wet streak that faded almost instantly. "I wasn't just sending words," Margaret said. "I was sending coordinates." Mrs. Carver gasped softly, adjusting her glasses. Lyon, Toulouse, Rouen, every city had someone waiting. "But you couldn't just say that in a letter. So we wrote stories. We made them sound sweet. Personal. I miss your eyes in the morning light." That meant dawn approached from the east. "I dreamt of us walking by the old mill again." That meant a target near a textile factory. She picked up another letter, unfolding it slowly. The paper crackled under her fingers. This one. This told a man named Henry where to place a mine on a railway bridge. But if intercepted, it read like a girl wishing she could visit her grandmother. Kayla blinked, and no one caught on. Margaret gave a short shrug. They came close. Once, one of my letters was opened by a border agent, but the ink had faded. They thought it was just romantic fluff. He laughed at me, said it was sweet, but silly. Emily touched one of the pages, careful not to smudge the fragile writing. "And did you ever hear back?" Margaret nodded. Sometimes weeks later, usually through someone else. A phrase in a newspaper article, a flower left on a bench, a postcard with a tiny mark on the corner. She opened another envelope. Inside was a card with a pressed violet, the stem dried and brittle. This meant the package arrived. A single violet, a blue one, meant it had been intercepted. A red meant compromised drone. The room was quiet, except for the soft tick of the old wall clock. Mrs. Carver cleared her throat. "Do you mind if these are preserved?" For the archive, Margaret folded the letters gently. "Some, not all. Some things belonged to ghosts who asked me not to let them be remembered." There was no argument. Later that evening, after the others had gone, Pastor Emily stayed behind to help Margaret return the items to the box. As she reached for the ribbon, she paused. Were any of them actually love letters? Margaret looked at her with that same unreadable calm. She said, "And some had to pretend they were." You learn not to let your feelings get in the way when the wrong word can get someone killed. She tied the ribbon again, the motion fluid. Final. Emily didn't press further. The box was placed back on the shelf in Margaret's closet that night, just as it had been for years. But now, its contents had names again. Coordinates. Shadows that once moved through night under a different sky. Sent there by a woman the world had overlooked. The folding chairs in the youth room had always been slightly uncomfortable. Vinyl seats that squeaked if you shifted too much, a whiteboard permanently stained by erasable markers, and leftover streamers from a birthday celebration 2 months ago still clinging to the corner. It was the room where games were played, snacks were eaten too quickly, and scripture discussions often dissolved into jokes. But lately, the tone had changed, quietly, without anyone officially deciding it. At first, it was just Kayla. She came in one Thursday afternoon after school, a spiral notebook tucked under her arm and a packet of printed articles clipped together with a pink binder clip. She didn't make eye contact with anyone at first, just sat near the end of the table and waited until the others arrived. The second to show up was Marcus, holding a small portable radio he'd borrowed from his grandfather. By the time the third teen walked in, they'd already cleared the table and pushed the snacks aside. It wasn't a lesson night. It wasn't even an official meeting, but Margaret Walsh was there. She sat at the front of the room, a small enamel tin on her lap, and a pair of oversized reading glasses perched low on her nose. Her cane rested beside her chair, though she hadn't needed it much that week. In front of her were 2 envelopes marked training aids in faded handwriting. The teens didn't know who wrote those labels, but they were beginning to suspect. They were original. Kayla opened her notebook. "Can you explain how the one-time pad works again?" she asked. "I read about it, but I don't get how it's unbreakable." Margaret didn't laugh. She didn't patronize. She simply nodded, picked up a piece of paper with a row of random numbers, and began demonstrating, slowly, carefully, drawing out the logic like she'd done it 100 times before. "Each message has its own unique key," she said. "The trick is, both people have to have the exact same key, and the key can never be reused." Marcus leaned forward, watching her point to each digit. "No machine can crack it?" he asked. "Not if it's used properly," she said. "Not even now." What began as curiosity turned into something else entirely over the next few weeks. The teens who had once whispered jokes about Margaret's old shoes and odd bracelet now brought her questions about things they could barely believe were real. They learned to recognize foreign insignia. They practiced writing simple substitution ciphers. One even tried to hide a coded message in a banana bread recipe, which made Margaret Chakwalin actual chuckle, light and surprised. Was no longer covered with half-eazed Bible verses and sarcastic doodles. Now it held diagrams of telegraph systems, examples of Morse code, and timelines drawn in multiple colors tracing the fall of occupied France. Margaret would occasionally pause beside it, correcting a date or an acronym, her handwriting slow but deliberate. Kayla started a blog. She didn't advertise it much, just quietly posted short entries under the title, "Listening to Margaret." Each post was part interview, part reflection. She included sketches of the old OSS logo, quotes Margaret had said almost offhandedly, and photographs of artifacts Margaret allowed her to borrow for a day or two: a compass pin, a smudged field map, a tin of disappearing ink capsules sealed tight dot. The blog's first post was titled, "The Woman in Pew 3. One afternoon, during what used to be free time, the group sat silently as Margaret read aloud a redacted field report from her own archive. They followed along as best they could, their eyes scanning the blacked-out names and coordinates, trying to piece together the shape of the mission beneath it. When she finished, no one spoke for a while. Then Marcus asked, "Did you ever want to stop?" Margaret looked up slowly. "Yes," she said, "but stopping wasn't the same as going home. Not for people like me." They didn't know what to say to that. They didn't need to. She closed the file and told them they'd done enough for the day as they packed up. Kayla lingered behind and asked if Margaret would come speak at her school's history club. "I don't give speeches," Margaret said. "I tell stories to people who want to know them." "That's exactly why I want them to hear you," Kayla replied. Margaret didn't give an answer that day, but 2 mornings later she called the school office and asked for the time and address quietly, without fanfare. The youth group never called themselves Changed. They never made a post about redemption. But they never laughed in the sanctuary again, not like before. The sun filtered through the stained glass window in long strips of muted color. Landing softly across the wooden table in the side chapel, the building was mostly quiet, except for the occasional creak of the rafters and the distant hum of the janitor's vacuum in Fellowship Hall. Pastor Emily sat across from Margaret, a lukewarm cup of coffee in her hands, her eyes tracing the lines of the older woman's face. They hadn't scheduled this conversation. It had happened the way many of their talks did, organically, without preamble. Drawn out by silence rather than urgency, Margaret had come in early, far earlier than she needed to, and waited in the chapel with her coat folded over her lap and her gaze fixed on the polished cross at the far end of the wall. Emily, having just set down her satchel in the office, noticed her and joined her. Without asking, they talked about nothing at first. The weather, the price of coffee, the way the new hymnals creaked when opened. Then quietly, without even looking up, Margaret said, "I almost had it taken off." Emily wasn't sure what she meant at first. She waited. "The tattoo," Margaret clarified, "the one on my wrist." She rubbed the edge of her sleeve, eyes still forward. "There was a clinic in Baltimore. They said it'd take several sessions and it might leave a scar. But I didn't mind the scar. I just didn't want the questions anymore." Emily nodded slowly, careful not to fill the silence too quickly. "I'd gone to a church out there, bigger than this one. No one knew me, which is what I wanted at the time. Anonymity. I was tired of the stares. The guesses. One man asked me if it was gang. A teenager called it prison ink. I thought if I just erased it, maybe I could finally just be an old woman at church. No more, no less. Her fingers moved absent-mindedly, tracing the faint edge of the tattoo through her blouse. The dagger, the wings, the hidden circle, a symbol few recognized anymore, even fewer understood. "But you didn't," Emily said quietly. "No," Margaret said. "I didn't. I scheduled the consultation, drove 2 hours, sat in the parking lot, watched a woman walk in before me, with a name scrawled across her forearm, watched her come out holding a brochure and looking 10 years older. I sat there for a long time." She paused. "I realized I wasn't trying to get rid of it because I regretted it. I was trying to get rid of it because I didn't think anyone cared anymore. I thought history had become noise, something people skimmed, then forgot." Emily watched her closely. "But something made you keep it." Margaret gave a small shrug. "Maybe. I was just too tired to walk in." She shifted in her chair, her voice quieter now. "But I think I knew deep down that it wasn't mine to erase. Not really. That mark was earned. That ink was pressed into my skin by a medic in Lyon under a single lamp, the night before I jumped from a plane. It wasn't decoration. It was a signal, and it outlived the war. Outlived the men who designed it. Outlived the missions that were never written down. It became part of me in ways I didn't expect." Emily nodded, her hands wrapped around her cooling mug. The silence hung like soft cloth between them. Margaret leaned back slightly. "Now kids take pictures of it," she said, almost laughing. "They ask questions. They treat it like it's rare. Funny how it had to grow old before it was allowed to matter." Emily didn't respond right away. She didn't need to. The moment wasn't about fixing anything. It was about the quiet revelation of what had nearly been erased and the weight of choosing not to. Later that day, as Margaret stood in the hallway, a boy from the youth group passed her with a respectful nod. He didn't laugh, he didn't stare. He simply looked at the tattoo and said, "That's the dagger, right?" Margaret smiled. That's right, she didn't cover her wrist again that day. The congregation had gathered like they always did on Sundays, early arrivals settling into their preferred pews, bulletins passed out by teens in oversized name tags, and the choir humming softly in the corner near the organ. Pastor Emily had kept her voice light that morning, welcoming everyone, reminding them of the upcoming potluck, and slipping in a quiet nod to a very special birthday in our midst. She didn't say more than that. Margaret Walsh sat in her usual place at the end of the front row, coat folded over her lap, a scarf tied loosely at her throat. The tattoo on her wrist was barely visible, though it hadn't gone unnoticed in months. She nodded politely as people passed by, some offering warm greetings, some just a glance that lingered a moment longer than usual. She didn't expect more than that. The attention had never been something she sought. It had simply followed her lately, like a shadow she no longer bothered to shake. As the final hymn was announced and the organ softly began its opening notes, the back doors of the church opened with a quiet firmness that turned heads. At first, no one quite understood what they were seeing. 2 men and 1 woman entered dressed in crisp, dark uniforms, each bearing the insignia of different branches: Army, Air Force, Navy. Their movements were smooth, deliberate, their steps echoing faintly on the tile. In their hands, a triangularly folded American flag, wrapped in white gloves and held with a kind of reverence that made even the teenagers go still. Margaret turned slowly, her eyes locked on the woman leading them. Something in her expression faltered. They didn't speak. The organ stopped. Pastor Emily stepped aside. The honor guard came forward until they reached the front, standing just feet from where Margaret sat. The lead officer, a woman with silver streaks in her hair and a voice steady but gentle, turned toward the congregation first. "We are here today to honor Margaret Walsh," she said, "on the occasion of her 96th birthday and for services rendered to this country under extraordinary conditions." No one moved. The woman turned toward Margaret and lowered her head respectfully. She stepped forward and extended the folded flag. Margaret stared at it. Her lips parted slightly, but no sound came. Her hands lifted slowly, almost involuntarily, and accepted the flag as if it weighed far more than cloth and thread. The congregation didn't know whether to clap. No one quite knew what to do, and so they stood. Every one of them, silent, upright, as if some instinct deeper than habit had taken over. Pastor Emily approached and placed a gentle hand on Margaret's shoulder, but said nothing. Margaret's eyes were fixed on the flag, her fingers curled tightly around its edges. She had been recognized before, briefly, accidentally, in whispers and passing nods. But never like this, never with an entire sanctuary quiet around her, and an official from Washington reading words she never thought would be spoken aloud. "There are some contributions," the officer said softly, "that history does not record quickly, but it does remember." Afterward, the service continued, but it didn't quite return to normal. Hymns were sung, but with more restraint. Prayers were spoken, but with deeper cadence. People walked past Margaret as they left, some touching her shoulder, others offering brief, wordless nods. One small child handed her a flower without saying anything at all. Margaret held the flag close. Her hands never once let go of it. At coffee hour, the teens from the youth group didn't gather by the snack table. They stood near the front of Fellowship Hall, quiet and observant. One of them finally approached her, awkward and nervous, and said, "Happy birthday, Ms. Walsh," and "Thank you." Margaret looked at him. Her voice returned in fragments, barely above a whisper. "You're welcome," she said, "but I was just one of many." Later that afternoon, the flag remained on her lap as she sat in the garden courtyard. Behind the church, the breeze pulling lightly at the ends of her scarf. Pastor Emily joined her, both women watching the clouds shift above the steeple. "You really didn't know?" Margaret asked, glancing sideways. Emily smiled softly. "I might have had a feeling they didn't say much after that." The weight of the folded triangle between them spoke louder than any sermon could. The sanctuary was fuller than usual that Sunday, not with noise or movement, but with a kind of breathless stillness that settled over every pew. People sat with folded hands and bowed heads, not out of routine, but out of a shared sense of reverence. A framed photo sat on a small table near the pulpit, black and white image of a younger woman in a military coat. Her gaze level, her features sharp. Next to it was a small notebook, its corners worn, the binding frayed. Margaret's journal. Pastor Emily stood beside it. There was no choir today, no procession, just the soft creak of wood and the occasional cough that sounded louder than anyone intended. Emily opened the journal with careful fingers and paused, letting the silence stretch. She glanced at the first page, nodded to herself, then began to read. "Some wars never end." The first line read, her voice even low, not the kind in history books, not the kind with treaties and parades, the other kind, the ones you carry. She looked up, scanning the room. Margaret's absence was felt in every row, especially the front pew, where her scarf had once draped over the backrest, and where she had always sat alone, as if keeping something or someone company only she could see. Emily continued, "In what you didn't say at the dinner table, in what you flinched at when the fireworks went off, in the way you remembered faces that others forgot." There were soft sniffles from the back. A man took off his glasses and wiped his eyes. "I carried mine in ink," the journal went on. "A small tattoo, not for decoration, but identification. It meant I had done something, that I had been somewhere, that I was part of a war people weren't supposed to talk about." Emily's voice caught for a moment. She took a breath, then read on. "For a long time, I believed I would die with my story untold, that people would remember the coat I wore, to church, the way I limped, the way my coffee cup rattled when I carried it, but they wouldn't know why." She turned the page. "But if you live long enough," Margaret wrote, "sometimes the truth gets its moment. Not the whole truth, not the kind that makes headlines or history lessons. Just a moment, a glance, a nod. A child asking you a question without laughing. That's enough." A hush fell over the room like a quilt laid gently across shoulders. Pastor Emily closed the journal softly. There had been no eulogy, no family stepping forward. Margaret had outlived nearly everyone she once called her own, but she had not left alone. Not anymore. The folded flag sat at the altar, and the OSS insignia, once misunderstood, was now printed on the back of the church bulletin beneath a quote, "She was a woman who didn't wait to be told she could do something." After the service, the youth group remained behind, lingering near the photo. One of the girls, Lee, held a crumpled tissue in one hand and a notebook in the other. She had begun transcribing Margaret's journal, piece by piece, With the help of Pastor Emily, they didn't know what to do with it yet. Maybe a small booklet, maybe a display in the fellowship hall, maybe something more outside. The breeze moved gently through the trees, and an older man placed a single white flower near the base of the church steps. "We served the same side," he murmured to know. One in particular, back inside, the photo remained, eyes steady, expression unreadable. The war was over, but some echoes lingered. And now, finally, someone was listening.